we left off with this information or this figure here. And again, this is something that you definitely start off with this, okay? Learn the basics, all right? Then you can move on to the more detailed stuff, which is what we're going to get into now, okay? So a lot of these slides we saw in lab. Okay, so we're just going to run through a quick review, okay? Because we, again, a lot, I won't say a lot, but a certain significant amount of the material here in this lecture today will be reviewed from when we did this material in lab. So again, when we're naming our epithelium, all right, the first name is going to be the cell layer, and the second name was going to be the shape of the cell. Okay, so I'm going to assume that everybody knows what simple and squamous are. Simple cuboidal, stratified cuboidal. I'm going to assume that you all know that. All right, but what I want to get into is some of the stuff down here near the bottom. All right, but one, this is the thinnest possible barrier, and you want thin layers or thin barriers when we're going to do certain types of functions like absorption, secretion, and filtration. So this is great when we're talking about the lungs. It allows us rapid movement of molecules across this barrier. All right, oxygen and carbon dioxide, those are our respiratory gases. So when they're traveling across, all right, the alveoli into the blood vessels there, the capillary blood vessels, all right, they're going through very thin layers because the alveoli are one cell layer thick, all right, and also the capillaries are one cell layer thick. So these respiratory gases have to just go through or, well, cross through or in between two cell layers, which is great. Better to cross through two than 20 or 30, okay? So remember the names of epithelium when it lines vessel walls, and that's lymph vessels and blood vessels. We refer to that as endothelium. You need to know that, okay? The four membranes in our body, we'll hit that here at the end of this chapter, all right? You've got serous membrane, cutaneous membrane, mucous membrane, and synovial membrane, all of which we're going to kind of touch on in this semester. But we already talked about the serous membrane. Another name for that epithelium is mesothelium. Okay, keep that in mind. So you've heard mesothelioma. All right, that is a cancer of that serous membrane. All right, so I won't zoom in like I did in lab, but you can see here are these air sacs here. They're one cell layer thick. Here's a capillary over here with its blood, all right, the erythrocyte. All right, so it allows for that diffusion, and again, it's simple diffusion, all right, for respiratory gases to cross over, all right, the alveoli lining and the endothelium there. All right, simple cuboidal, all right, I'm assuming you all know that. We're going to move down here, all right, when you think of or hear cuboidal cells, think of glands. For the most part, you won't be wrong if you're thinking glands for simple epithelium, cuboidal, all right? And when we're dealing with stratified cuboidal, all right, and even in some cases stratified columnar, those are going to be support, they play more of a support role, but with glands, all right? So again, with simple cuboidal, we're going to see this absorption here in later in 211 when we're talking about renal physiology, all right? The renal tubules have a simple layer, all right, of cuboidal cells that exchange certain molecules. Some will exchange hydrogen ions, and some will exchange sodium and potassium. But we'll see that occur across those cuboidal cells. So it's great for absorption. And then with the secretion part here, think of glands. Okay, glands, I'll say it all day long, glands. All right. So you can see here, this is a beautiful example of that simple cuboidal, all right, nice square-shaped cell, nice spherical, rounded nucleus right in the center, okay? And then the space here, that's the lumen here. We're looking here at the kidney tubule here, all right? So we're going to be seeing, all right, several things being absorbed and secreted, all right, across these cells here. And you get to go into that in much more detail next semester. Okay, simple cuboidal, there's two types. The non-ciliated and the ciliated. All right, so again, because it's simple, great for secretion and also great for absorption, especially when we're dealing with this type, all right, of epithelium. Because the non-ciliated has that brush border, that microvilli, all right, and we'll see that in our in our digestive tract, okay? All right, so let's start off here. We're going to look at the non-ciliated, okay? That's going to be the one that's got the brush border here, all right, which is microvilli, okay? And it's going to have goblet cells. Goblet cells are, if you look at, and we're going to go over glands here later on in this chapter. All right, they're unicellular glands. That means they're one cell. Okay, we saw that when in lab. All right, when we were looking at the epithelium here. All right, so you've got that one cell, and it's going to create that glycoprotein. All right, that mucin. Okay, which doesn't really do too much until it combines with water, and then it creates mucus, and then it secretes it into the lumen of your digestive tract. Helps to neutralize, okay, the acidic components from your stomach acid, but it also helps to lubricate, okay, your small intestine and parts of the large intestine so things can slide through. So it actually decreases abrasion, okay? So important that you know that it makes mucus when we add water to it, okay? So you're going to pretty much see this type of epithelium, all right, all the way from the stomach to the anus. All right, so that's going to include your small intestine, all three parts, duodenum, jejunum, ileum, and then your large intestine, okay? Your sigmoid colon, which is the last part of your large intestine, the rectum, and then down to the anus, okay? Keep that in mind. So when we're looking here at our picture down here, all right, you can see here, now, this one I will zoom in on. It's got a nice example for the brush border. Here's your brush border, it's nice and uniform. All right, you got your goblet cells interspersed, all right, and you can see your columnar epithelial cell here, and you've got the nucleus here at the basilar region here, all right, ABKB. So the other type of simple columnar epithelium is going to be our ciliated, all right. So this type, now ciliated, as you guys remember, it's the apical surface modification of the cell, all right, which is a hair-like structure, and it has to do with movement. But in this case, the cell stays stationary, and the cilia move things by the cell, okay? So in this case, it's going to move mucus. So if it's moving mucus, we need a cell to make the mucus. So this type of epithelium has goblet cells, okay? So we're going to see this type of epithelium. We've already seen, all right, the other type of epithelium in the digestive tract. So I want you to start to think of the respiratory tract, okay? So in the bronchioles, how many times when you've gotten sick, you're coughing up mucus, you're hacking up mucus. It comes from this epithelium here, okay? But also, and you've heard me mention this, about the uterine tubes, all right? When the egg is released from the ovary, it's got to make its way to the uterus, okay? Eggs don't have flagellum like sperm do. So they just float there aimlessly. So they need help getting to their destination, all right? And that help comes from the cilia. So they beat in that direction towards the uterus, and it takes anywhere from 5 to 6 days for that egg to get from the ovary into the uterus for fertilization, okay? So keep that in mind. All right. And then we've got this guy, our falsely stratified columnar epithelium. This is the one when you look at where you think, oh yeah, all right, this is a multi-layered type of epithelium. No, okay? Pseudo meaning falsely stratified, okay? So the component, the ideal understanding that I need you to have with this type of epithelium is that every single cell makes contact with the basement membrane. It's a great test question, okay? Great test question. All right, but not every single cell makes it to the apical surface there, okay? And because the nuclei are kind of staggered on top, and I'll show you a picture here, are kind of staggered on top of one another, it gives you the appearance that it's stratified. Because if we go to this one, well, yeah, we'll get there. We'll get there. All right, there's two types, ciliated and non-ciliated. All right, so let's start with the ciliated. Okay, obviously it's called ciliated because it has cilia on top. And again, the cilia needs to move mucus. So we'll see goblet cells there. All right. So in addition to the ciliated simple columnar, we're also going to see this type of epithelium in the respiratory system. But it's going to be in the larger passageways. So what are those? Your nasal cavity, all right, parts of your pharynx, which is your throat, okay? So you're going to see it in the larger areas where we saw the ciliated simple columnar, that was in the bronchioles. That's the smaller, very small passageways of your respiratory system, okay? All right, so if we look at this picture here, and I'll even zoom in a little bit. I know I said I wasn't going to, but you can see, all right, how it looks like, because you got a nucleus up here, a nucleus down here, it looks stratified, all right? But obviously it's not. So every single one of these cells is connected to the basement membrane here, all right? But you can tell that some of them aren't making it here to the apical surface. All right, the other type of pseudostratified is the non-ciliated. This stuff is pretty rare. So it's got nothing, okay? It doesn't have cilia, and it doesn't have goblet cells. There's no point in having cilia if you don't have anything for it to move, all right? There's no goblet cells, okay? So its main function is protection, okay? So because it's rare, you're only going to find it in two places, all right? The male urethra and the epididymis. Okay, there's three parts to the male urethra, right, which you'll learn next semester in 211, but the epididymis is associated with the testicle. You guys remember that, right? Okay, it's a little ridge-like structure. All right, that's where sperm like to hang out and mature. Okay, so that's it for the simple. Let's get on to the stratified squamous, okay? So again, a couple things. I'm going to assume that you all know about how to name and, you know, based on levels and the shape. All right, but I want to get down to here. All right, their functions, protection. Okay, big time for protection. They also will help with support, structural support. Do you remember how we named this type of epithelium? Remember for the epididymis? Excuse me, for the epidermis. We talked about the stratum basale, that bottom layer there, and how the cells appear to be cuboidal or low columnar. But we don't name the epidermis for that type of epithelium. We name it for the apical layer, what's in the stratum corneum. And that's that squamous cell shape. So that's what this is referring to. We're going to name, all right, the cells for whatever the apical layer is in appearance. That's how we name stratified epithelium, okay? So when we're dealing with stratified squamous, even though the basilar layers are going to be cuboidal or polyhedral or low columnar, they'll refer to them as, like in our epidermis, all right? We name it for the apical cells, okay? So the bottommost cell, their job is the stem layer cell. They're going to divide all the time, okay? That's all their job is supposed to do, because you're obviously going to be continually losing skin cells all the time. You ever wake up in the morning and you got your window open, and it's a beautiful day outside, and you're looking out and you can see the sunbeam shining through, and you see this stuff floating in the sunbeam? That's your skin. It's floating away. Literally, the majority of the dust in your house is, well, I'd like to say your skin and whoever else's skin's in there, you know, maybe your dog, your pet. But point being is you're constantly sloughing off skin. Okay, so you have to constantly regenerate that lost skin, and that's what the cells do in the basilar layer. They're just continuously dividing to replace those lost cells there. Okay. For the stratified squamous. Yep. Yes, sir.
So would you find like like that word? Would you find that more in your palms and your thumb, the soles of your feet? That this is where it sloughs off the most?
Well, the keratinizes the dead stuff.
The keratin.
Yeah. Yeah. You think of, and I'll go over this in a second, but I want you to think non-keratinized cell in places that are moist. Okay, where there's liquid involved, like your mouth. Okay, parts of your anus, your throat. Okay, I'll show you. Keratinized, that's going to be your skin, both thick and thin. All right. So we'll start off with keratinized. What's keratin do? Keratin kills. That's right, kills. Okay? So these cells will be dead because of this protective protein called keratin. All right? It makes those cells stronger. Okay? It makes them stronger. We will find this type of squamous epithelium in the epidermis. Okay? We already talked about that in lab. All right, so we're pretty familiar with that. Okay, when we get to the stratum granulosum, that's the third layer, that's when these cells start to produce keratin, and that's when they start to die. Okay? All right, non-keratinized. All right, that means they're all alive, they're living, moist areas. Okay, so they will have their nucleus because they haven't produced that keratin. All right, so we will be able to see them when you do, if you ever do, they call them pith cells. That's when they do a scraping of your cheek. All right, and you put it on a microscopic slide and you look at all those cells will have nuclei in them. Okay, so we're going to see it. If you look here where it's found, oral cavity, that's moist. Part of your pharynx, that's your throat, moist. Esophagus, moist. Vagina and anus, areas where there's moisture. Okay, so think of non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. It's going to be found in moist areas, right? But you can also think it's going to be close to openings and I guess you could say exits to your body. Okay, so just kind of keep that in mind. All right, you guys at home doing all right? Any questions so far? Good? All right, cool. All right, so let's go to the next slide. Well, chime in if you have questions. Stratified cuboidal, all right? Again, please guys, when you see stratified cuboidal and stratified columnar, you want to think of these two things. Mainly a lot of protection here, all right, because we're going to offer some support here, all right? Because you're going to find it in the walls of the ducts of these, what we call exocrine glands. Remember, there's two types of glands. We'll get into this in a little bit more detail here, all right? You've got endocrine and exocrine. Exocrine have ducts, okay? These things, D-U-C-T-S. They have those, all right? Endocrine does not. Your thyroid gland is an endocrine gland. It does not. Your adrenal gland, all right, does not. All right, so there's many glands in your body that don't have a duct. Okay, so again, we'll find this type of epithelium strongly associated with glands, specifically sweat glands. Okay, and we'll find it in other areas too. All right, like the male urethra, and then on the outer portion, and you'll see it in much better detail when you do the reproductive chapter in 211. But the ovarian follicles. Okay, when you talk about parts of the ovary. Okay. So you're going to see it in tubes, right? Tubes are going to be the ducts, right? And then the coverings of some certain structures there, like the covering around the egg, all right, in the ovary, okay? All right, and then I won't say the last type of epithelium, but the last type of named cell-shaped epithelium, columnar. It's another rare type of epithelium here, okay? But again, it also does protection and secretion. And you're going to find this in the larger areas or regions of your salivary glands in your mouth. All right, and again, this columnar epithelium seems to have a predilection for the male urethra. All right, that's another way how I always remember where to find columnar epithelium. Or if I wasn't sure and I had to throw out a random guess, well, your chances are pretty good if you write in there parts of the male urethra. All right, if you're not sure. Okay, when it comes to columnar epithelium, okay, pseudostratified and columnar, okay. All right, transitional. This is the transformer one, okay. Urinary tract, one that changes shape, okay, based upon what state it's in. If it's empty and relaxed, then we're going to find it in a polycule, all right, or kind of a cuboidal shape. So it could be kind of cuboidal, but it also can look like a baseball net. Kind of like that, okay? But the important thing is when we're looking at the cells in the apical surface, they're rounded. So when when the bladder starts to fill up with urine, okay, the pressure of that urine presses on these cells and it causes them to flatten, okay? So they look more like squamous epithelium. And I'll show you a picture here. You guys remember this, the owl's eyes, the binucleated cells, right? This will be a cell that will have two nuclei inside of it. Right here. Okay, so you can kind of see empty bladder. All right, it's kind of rounded on the top here. Here you have a cell that has two nuclei inside of it. And then when we fill the bladder up with urine, we're squishing those top apical cells and they become flattened, right, like a squamous cell. Okay, so transitional is pretty much going to be found in the urinary tract. but we always use the bladder as an example. All right, make sure that you know this for the test, okay? Because there's going to be at least 1 or 2 questions that are going to ask you about the functions of certain types of epithelium, okay? So an easy way to remember is if it's simple, it's going to have absorption, secretion, diffusion, all right? If it's stratified, protection, okay? Just think of your skin. That's how I remembered it for stratified. And then epithelium, the simple epithelium, I always think of the squamous and cuboidal cells, simple squamous and cuboidal, you know, for absorption and secretion and diffusion of respiratory gases and whatnot. All right, so that's it for epithelium. Now we're going to climb into glands. All right, we didn't cover this in lab, so this will be a little bit new stuff for you folks. Okay. So one of the things that, and this is going to be a good kind of foundation for you, because when you learn chapter 17 and 211, this will be all this stuff will come back, so it'll be a good review. So make sure that you're paying attention to this. Okay. So first of all, a couple aspects about glands. All right. First is they can be made of just one cell or many cells. So we saw a unicellular gland, that was the goblet cell. All right. A multicellular gland would be your thyroid gland or your adrenal gland, your pancreas, okay? So it can be one cell or many, okay? And it's made up of, and this is very important that you know this, epithelium, all right, or epithelial tissue. You need to know that. Glands are made up of epithelial tissue, okay? So what's a gland do? Its job is to secrete. And it varies on its secretion. A couple examples here. We saw that the goblet cell did mucin. All right. A lot of our glands that are part of the endocrine system are going to produce hormones. Hormones are chemical messengers in our body. All right. Enzymes. Guess what? Your salivary glands. They are making digestive enzymes, lipase and amylase. And you'll learn about this in the digestive tract. That's where we start. Protein is no joke. It's a tough thing to digest. So your body is equipped yourself with several sites, several areas where it's going to start to digest protein. So it gets right to work in the mouth. All right. So you got salivary amylase and lipase, and the lipase will help to break down fats in the mouth. Okay. And then electrolytes. Guess what? Where does that come from? You ever lick your arm and when you've been sweating? Sweat. Okay. We'll find the electrolytes from sweat. So there's 2 types, endocrine and exocrine, okay? So keep in mind, all right, endocrine, they do not have ducts. They lack ducts. So since they don't have a duct to secrete whatever it is they're secreting, they're going to dump whatever they're making either into a blood vessel that's nearby or into the tissue that surrounds the cells. They'll just dump it into that tissue. And then those secretions can diffuse through that tissue, hopefully into a blood vessel, and then it can move through the body. Okay? So it's either going to dump it into the blood or to the interstitial fluid, which is that fluid that surrounds those cells. Okay? And then exocrine glands, they do have a duct. Okay? So that's nice because then whatever the secretions are, it can dump those secretions into the duct, and then that duct will carry the secretions to wherever. If it's a sweat gland, it'll carry it to the surface of your skin. All right. If it's a salivary gland, it'll carry it into your mouth. Okay. So that's what we're going to see. Now, here's something that you need to know. These ducts, all right, are going to be found to be covered with epithelium. All right. And that's one of the roles of that cuboidal epithelium that we were talking about. All right, it lines the ducts. So a couple of types of exocrine glands, sweat glands, mammary glands, salivary glands, they all have ducts. I know it sounds like I'm talking about the animal duct. I have to try to enunciate the T. It goes hand in hand. 2 parts. There's 2 parts to a gland. There's the secretory portion, all right, which is going to be the actual part of the gland that makes whatever the secretion is. And then you're going to have the conducting portion, which is going to be the actual duct itself. So yeah. Hold on one second. I want to see if I put that in here. Oh, good, I did. Okay. You knew I was going to show that. That's why you asked that. I planted her into the audience. All right. So our two types. The unicellular, okay, they do not have a duct. Okay? They do not. Okay, so the goblet cell, we've already seen this. Okay? So the goblet cell is actually interspersed in between the epithelium there. So it's going to release its the goblet cell has this kind of, we call it the goblet cell because the top portion kind of looks like this. All right? It's an opening, so it looks like a glass. And then you've got this part, and then at the bottom you've got the nucleus down here. It's a horrible drawing, but you know what I mean. And then you've got your glycoproteins of mucinin down in here. And then they move out this way. And then you'll have a columnar epithelium here, another columnar epithelium over here. Okay. Depending on what type, if it's non-ciliated or ciliated. Okay. All right. So the other type of gland is the multicellular gland. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. So we're going to kind of break down the anatomy of that. Okay, so I want you to think of grapes, and if you're not familiar with grapes, the grapes growing on a vine. That's what I want you to think of, all right? So there's a rounded portion to that, and we call that the acini, okay? And that's the part of the gland that is going to make whatever we're secreting, okay? And then from the acini region, we have our tube structure, which is the duct, and that's going to transport the secretions that we're making to wherever. All right, but it's going to be on the surface of the epithelial tissue. So if it's the sweat gland, it's going to lead that secretion onto the surface of your skin. Okay. Now these multicellular exocrine glands are surrounded by a fibrous capsule. Okay. So it helps to protect the gland, helps to give it structure, and two, so it doesn't collapse in on itself. And these fibrous capsules, and I'll show you a picture here in a second, they'll invaginate themselves, like here's our capsule, and then parts of that fibrous capsule will move into parts of that gland, all right? And it will start to separate or section off certain parts of that gland, all right? And those partitions we refer to as lobes, all right? It'll make sense here when I show you the picture. I know my drawings don't do it justice when I'm trying to describe it to you. So this is what I'm referring to. So here is your whole gland here. All right, and this kind of greenish area, that's the fibrous capsule. But then it invaginates, it pushes in, and it creates what we call septa. And it partitions these small compartments inside the actual gland itself. Okay, and it separates off those components there. All right, so then you have these smaller regions, and those are called lobes. Okay, this whole portion right here is a lobe. Okay, so now when we look in a small region, we're going to blow up, not literally, but we're going to zoom in here on this area here, right, and look at don't these kind of look like grapes? If you ever see, grapes off of a vine, all right, you go to the grocery store. When we zoom in, we notice, all right, it has a very similar structure to grapes. So this kind of bulbous area here, or this kind of rounded swelling region, that is the part of the gland that's going to be making our secretions. All right, we call that the acinus. All right, its physiological role is to secrete things. All right, so the anatomical or structural name for this area is the acinus. All right, the physiological or functional name would be the secretory portion. All right, that's where we're making our secretions. All right, and then this thinner tube-like structure, that's the duct. That's the conducting portion. So whatever the secretory portion makes, the acinus makes, it's going to move it or transmit it through the conducting portion or through the duct. You guys good with that? Okay. If I'm keeping it too simple, let me know. All right, this is what brings me to this part here. We talked about some of this when we were doing the skin, but it's very important that you know the 3 classifications here, all right, for exocrine glands. Okay, exocrine glands. That means they have ducts. Okay, so the first one is the merocrine gland. All right, we saw these in the skin. Well, actually, we saw all 3 types. Okay, the merocrine glands, all right, these guys, they're going to make their secretions inside the cell. Right, then that cell is going to package up those secretions into a secretory vesicle, and then it's going to move that secretory vesicle to the plasma membrane. You guys remember this process? The process of exocytosis, stuff exiting the cell. That secretory vesicle will fuse with the plasma membrane, and then it'll emit or discharge the contents of that secretory vesicle outside the cell. Okay, I'm going to come back to this. We'll zoom in. We do each picture and each description. So you can see here, okay, here's our merocrine gland. Here are our secretory vesicles. They move to the apical region here, and then through the process of exocytosis, it emits, all right, its secretions into this area here, into the lumen, and then they'll just transmit and travel up, all right, and out of the gland through the conducting region. And our example here is the salivary gland, so this is going to go into your mouth. All right, so those salivary glands, all right, are merocrine glands. Okay, so they have your secretions, all right, are emitted into this lumen here, and then they travel through the duct into your mouth. All right, so your tears are made the same way, and some of the sweat glands are made that way. Okay. All right, apocrine glands. This is the one where I think I was describing to you folks. Think of a lava lamp. If you're not familiar with a lava lamp, it's okay because most of you are very young. All right. I think you have to be at least 40 years or older to know what a lava lamp is. All right. I know. I think they've made a resurgence though. I've seen some. Actually, one of my daughter's friends has one in her room. She's 10. So, anyways, apocrine glands. Think of the apical. You have one? That's funny.
Was that coming out when you were a kid?
I just know that they were popular, but so were water beds. So I mean, we made a lot of bad decisions when I was growing up as a kid.
Maybe it's cool now because it's retro. It's
Maybe.
so old.
Oh yeah, bell bottoms came back for a short period of time. I love it. I think a lot of lamps. I always wanted one. My parents didn't trust me. All right. So when we're talking about apocrine glands, you look at the first 2 letters, AP. I want you to think of the apical region or the apical membrane of these cells. And they literally pinch right off. So that apical membrane part that pinches off, right, literally becomes the secretion. So these types of secretions are going to be thicker, more viscous. Okay? So we see this in our mammary glands and then our ears, all right? The ceruminous glands, where sebum is made, earwax. Okay? So I'm going to come back to this picture. All right, so here is what the, whoops, that's the holocrine. There we go, apocrine. So you can see how the top part of these cells are just kind of pinching off, all right, like these balloons, kind of like, or these bubbles, kind of like, for those of you that have a lava lamp, you know what I'm talking about, right? It pinches off, and then they'll travel out of the lumen through the ducts and into, and this, what's our example here, is the mammary gland, all right, or in the ear for earwax. Okay, so this type of secretion is going to be thicker than this type of secretion because we're getting more solids added to it. All right, your plasma membrane is made up of phospholipids, some cholesterol there, and proteins. All right, that's part of the reason why your milk, mother's milk, breast milk, all right, in addition to what's also being secreted into the mammary milk, but it has a high fatty and protein content, and part of that is from the cells, the plasma membranes, being incorporated into the secretion there. All right. So that's the apocrine gland. The last one is the holocrine gland. This is the one I was talking to you about. You think of something that's a holocaust, it's deadly, all right? So it involves destruction. Well, that's what happens with this type of gland here. The whole cell ruptures and becomes the secretion. So it's a self-destructive type of scenario here. So the cell kind of crumbles apart, blows up, however you want to look at it, all right? And then it becomes the secretion. So we see that with our sebaceous glands, all right? Those glands that we find affiliated with the hair follicles. So this type of secretion will be even more viscous or thicker, okay? I'll show you a picture here. I'm always showing pictures.
Is that one just sebaceous gland?
Yep. So here you can see, all right, all these cells are just kind of disintegrating, all right, and they're breaking apart and they become the actual secretion. All right, or part of, I shouldn't say they become, they're part of the secretion. All right, and in this case, all right, the cell contents get emitted right onto the hair follicle there. Okay. All right, let's talk about connective tissue. Okay. CT, and you've already seen this slide because I used it in the lab. All right, but you do need to know, I've seen test questions asked on this part right here. It being the most diverse and abundant type of tissue in the body. Okay, it's not epithelium. Okay, it's connective tissue. It is the most diverse and abundant tissue type in our bodies. Okay. So, similar to some of the epithelium, it has a support and protect type of function. But it also helps to bind organs. And when we're talking about binding organs, bones are organs, all right? So connective tissue helps to, ligaments and tendons, those are connective tissue, all right? And they're binding to bone, okay? They help to stabilize bone. Cartilage the same way, all right? Your ribs, okay? But also you'll have reticular tissue too that will help to bind to these organs here. So all of it, like tendons and ligaments, help with support, all right? Adipose tissue, all right? What does that do? Protection, right? Cushioning, all right, around certain organs, all right? Cartilage and bone, that's a support role. And then blood, okay? That is going to be more for transport. So when we're talking about the embryonic stem cell tissue for connective tissue, remember this guy right here, right? Mesenchyme. Mesenchyme is the primitive form of connective tissue. Then it starts to divide and differentiate into different types of connective tissue. So remember when we talked about epithelium, one of the key characteristics, and this was the last class, was that it's avascular. Okay? You need to know that. You could be asked that on the test. Epithelium, and think about it, does your epidermis have capillaries in it? The epidermis. That's all epithelial tissue. It doesn't. No, it does not. Okay? Now your dermis, that's a different story. Okay? So with connective tissue, all right, its vascularity ranges. Okay? You can have connective tissue that's very vascular. Loose connective tissue is very vascular. And a type of loose connective tissue is areolar. Adipose is another type of loose connective tissue. Okay? Something that's going to have poor amounts of vascularity is going to be dense regular connective tissue. Does anyone know an example of dense regular connective tissue? That's right. Tendons and ligaments, right here. Tendons and ligaments are dense regular connective tissue. They have poor vascularity. That's why it takes a long time for them to heal. Okay? Especially the Achilles tendon. The Achilles tendon can take over a year to heal. Okay, well, and plus it's far away from the heart. Okay, but it doesn't have the best blood supply.
Wait, so how, like, when we do surgery, they go and fix it, what do they exactly do?
It depends on what happened to it. If it actually ripped and tore, then they have to actually sew parts of it together. They can do some tissue grafting there. I mean, not literally staple it together, but they, yeah,
So could you take like certain tissue from another part of the body and replace it?
Yep. And that's what some techniques in which they'll use certain tissue that has a decent amount of vascularity in there, and they'll put it in close proximity, and that will help. Yeah.
Grows
It's like a graft. Yeah, very similar. And then also with mature cartilage. Now notice we say mature cartilage because immature cartilage doesn't have a blood supply for a short period of time. All right, but mature cartilage, all cartilage, all right, is pretty much avascular. And the only way that cartilage can get nutrients is through the process of the passive process. Remember our processes? Active and passive processes? What were the two? I heard it. Diffusion. Diffusion. Yeah, because it's not osmosis, because that involves water. Right? Okay, good. You need to know that. Diffusion is facilitated through movement. The more movement you have, the more diffusion you can have. All right, functions. We saw this in lab, so I'm just going to do this as a quick review. All right, physical protection, bones, cartilage, right? Protects organs. Okay, support and structural framework, we talked about that. Bones and cartilage, ligaments, tendons. All right. Also, reticular tissue helps to. Yes, ma'am.
Question about particular. I keep thinking of fascia. Is that particular tissue?
No, fascia is going to be a dense irregular connective tissue.
Okay.
Yeah. Reticular tissue, I want you to think of lymph nodes. Okay, it has a lot of reticular tissue in there. They can create compartments like that lobe that I showed you, not that lobe, that gland that you saw earlier. Something similar to that. All right. Binding structures, all right, that's going to allow us to connect things. Storage, that's a big one for adipose. Bone is also a storage site for calcium and phosphorus. All right. Transport, that's our fluid connective tissue. All right. And then immune protection, again, fluid connective tissue. That's including our white blood cells. Tons of that. Okay. So keep that in mind. All right. Mesenchyme. All right, keep in mind those are the stem cells. All right, that all these connective tissue, all right, is going to come from. But even in our adult form of connective tissue, we still have some mesenchyme tissue sitting around, just hanging out. All right, because if there's damage to that tissue, then that mesenchyme tissue can be activated to make repairs or regenerate new cells. Okay. All right, and then, well, mucous connective tissue, we haven't really talked about that, but we will see some embryonic connective tissue. That's why in the umbilical cord, you probably have heard that. Now, it's too late for me. They weren't they weren't collecting umbilical cords at the time. But in some hospitals, they'll ask you if you would like the umbilical cord to be stored for your child or whatever. It's up to you. Some places will offer the service where they'll keep it in case something later on in that child's life, they can actually get some stem cells from the umbilical cord, and they can use that to help repair tissue. All right, it's kind of new technology. You probably heard of stem cells, surgery, not surgeries, but treatments. And there's different stem cell colonies. I won't get into that, but it helps to regenerate cartilage, for example. You're seeing that a lot in people that have degenerated cartilage in their knees, for example, or other joints. You can get colonies of stem cells from a donor and use that, and they can repopulate some of that damaged tissue. Okay, connective tissue classification. We already saw this. I'm not going to review this, but I want you to know, keep in mind, all right, the three types of connective tissue. Connective tissue proper, supporting, and then fluid. And then we'll break it down. We're going to go through all these here. Quick review, though. Quick review, trust me. All right. So the first type of connective tissue is the connective tissue proper. All right. So we're going to talk about the loose connective tissue. This is the one that has all that space there. Because remember, the three components of connective tissue are going to be the cells, protein fibers, all right, and ground substance. And we combined the protein fibers and ground substance together, and we'll call that the extracellular matrix. Okay? So in this type of connective tissue, you have very few cells, all right, but you have tons of ground substance. all right? And you won't have a lot of protein fibers either. So think of the ground substance like as the canvas on a picture, okay? So you'll see a lot of white in this picture, okay? Few cells, some haphazard arrangements for the protein fibers, but a lot of ground substance, okay? So this stuff is great for the bodies, what we refer to as the packing material, okay? So if we need to fill space, you know, like some politicians' speeches, they have what they call seat fillers. Well, that's what this is. You know, we're just filling space in the body here with this type of connective tissue here. And it's a great type of connective tissue because, again, we can get blood vessels to grow into it, okay? So there's three types: areolar, adipose, and reticular, okay? So the first one here is going to be the areolar. All right, so you're going to have collagen and elastic fibers. All right, but again, there's no pattern to the way that the collagen and the elastic fibers are laid down. Remember we talked about the lines of cleavage, all right, in the skin, and that's because these collagen and elastic fibers were in bundles, but they're usually in a certain pattern. All right, in this connective tissue, it's just haphazard, it's just all over the place, but it has a high amount of blood vessels there, okay? So it's made up of both the fixed and the wandering cells. Wandering cells, the majority of wandering cells are white blood cells, so you'll find a decent amount of white blood cells in this area. All right, but we'll find a lot of ground substance. So we're going to see this in the top layer, or excuse me, the more superficial region of the dermis, the papillary layer. Okay, because remember the papillary layer, it's the smaller of the two dermal layers, but we saw a lot of blood vessels in them. Because we got to get those blood vessels in close position to the epidermis. Epidermis does not have its own blood supply. So that stratum basale, that layer there, needs blood vessels. It can't get the nutrients because it doesn't have a blood supply, but it gets it through diffusion. Okay? In the subcutaneous layer, we'll find it along with adipose tissue. Again, since it's the body's packing material, we find it around organs. All right, you'll find it in quite a few layers of nerves and muscle tissue. All right, we'll go through that in later chapters. All right, but we'll find it on the innermost layer of your nerves and the innermost layer of your muscles. Okay. All right, adipose. This is the easy one. Okay, there's two types. All right, you got white and brown fat. Okay, but the predominant cell type in adipose tissue is the adipocytes. Those are the cells that accumulate lipids. All right, now when we're born, we have both types, white and brown. Okay, you'll see much more in brown. All right, and that's because for the babies, all right, they need insulation. Okay. So the brown offers more of an insulation type of function, all right? So as we grow older, all right, the brown fat dissipates and we're left mainly with the white fat here, okay? So you need to know the functions of adipose tissue, all right? Storage, energy storage, cushioning, insulation, all right? So keep that in mind. Now, depending on your energy needs, all right, and a couple other factors like metabolism and whatnot, all right, will determine the amount of adipose tissue you have. All right, if you have high energy output and very low energy input, meaning you exercise a ton, you don't eat that much, all right, then your adipose tissue levels should be lower. All right, with other factors playing a role. I'm not going to get into metabolism and all that. Okay, but if you're a relatively sedentary person or a person that does nothing, and you eat, I'm going to be really outrageous when I say this, 10,000 calories a day, right? And the most you do is get out of bed and sit in a chair, all right? Then you'll have a higher amount, all right, of adipose tissue in your body. All right, reticular. Again, this is the one here that, again, this is the last of the loose connective tissue, all right? But we have these structures here are going to have all these little compartments, and you can see here in our picture, all right? These are reticular fibers, and there's all these little small compartments here, all right? And it allows for white blood cells to hang out, all right? And some of the other cell types that like to wander around, the fibroblasts, right? So the organ that we're seeing here is the spleen. And think of the spleen as this organ that checks all the floating cells. And that's where, actually, the spleen is where your red blood cells go to die, right? The spleen will look at some of the red blood cells and be like, no, you're damaged, or you're getting too old. We're going to start to break you down, all right? You also have tons of white blood cells in this area too, because they're going to help breaking down the red blood cells. But also, and again, you'll learn this in the immune chapter, you're going to have a certain population of cells that just float around. And they look at stuff. They'll find like a random protein floating around. They're like, oh, what is that? I don't know what that is, but they'll grab it. They'll phagocytize it. They'll digest it and break it apart. And then it starts to put parts of the protein on its body. And then it floats around the body, and it goes to other white blood cells, and it tells the white blood cells, look what I found. What is this? All right, and some of that happens here in the spleen, okay? All right, the next type of connective tissue is the proper connective tissue. Well, not the next type, sorry. Still on the first type is the dense connective tissue. Okay, this is the one that has very little ground substance, okay? But it has tons of protein fibers, all right? Specifically collagen, because collagen is the strongest. All right, so you're going to see this type of connective tissue, the dense connective tissue. All right, we're going to see three different types here: dense regular, dense irregular, and then elastic. Okay, the first one we see in tendons and ligaments. This is the lasagna noodle configuration. You can see how all of these, all right, collagen fibers are laying virtually right on top of one another. Okay. And there's very little, there's little white spots here. That's the ground substance. There's hardly any ground substance here. Right, this is a nucleus here for a fibroblast. Okay, so the fibroblasts are the cells that make the collagen. Okay, so again, in dense connective tissue, there's not a lot of ground substance, so there's not a lot of space in between the protein fibers, so we're not going to see a lot of blood vessels. Okay, so you have very few blood vessels there. Hence, that's why it takes longer for this type of tissue to heal. All right. The next one is the dense irregular. Okay. So in this situation, the collagen isn't laid down in a nice uniform parallel pattern to one another. It's going to be all over the place, and it's in bundles. Okay. The good thing about this type of connective tissue is that it can withstand multi-directional forces, like your skin. Right? You start tugging on your skin in all these different directions, it's not going to tear off your body. Okay? And that's because it can handle those forces in all those directions there. And that's due to the collagen. Okay? That it's laid down in those bundles there. Right? And also because there's elastic tissue there in your skin. Okay? So we're going to see this type of connective tissue. All right? Now this is important. This is the #1 connective tissue in the dermal layer of your skin. I've seen that asked on test before. Okay? So the #1 or the most predominant type of connective tissue in the papillary layer is what in the skin? Papillary layer. Remember? Areolar. That's right. Areolar is the #1 or the most abundant type of connective tissue in the papillary layer. So in the in our reticular layer, okay, it's going to be dense irregular connective tissue. Okay. All right. You'll also find it in this structure here. It's called the periosteum of the bone. That's the covering that goes around your bones. It's found everywhere on your bone except on the what we call the articular ends. We'll talk about that in chapter 7. Okay, but it's this covering that goes around the bone. Well, cartilage has its own version of that, and we call that perichondrium. And then we'll also find this type of connective tissue that forms capsules around some of our internal organs. So any organ that when we say there's a capsule around that organ, your immediate thought should be dense irregular connective tissue. It's what makes up that capsule. Okay? Yes, ma'am. So, For the reticular layer, yes. Yes, I was just being more specific. I said the dermis, but I needed to be specific for that. It's the number one for the reticular layer. And the reticular layer is the bigger and thicker layer, so it's going to be more abundant overall in the dermis because the papillary layer is smaller, so you'll have less in comparison. Okay. So the last type of dense connective tissue is, is elastic. Okay. And so again, this is because, right, the elastic protein fibers are laid down, all right, close to one another. All right. But as you know, elastic fibers, just from if you have gym shorts or whatever, elastic stretches and it recoils. But because these are densely packed towards one another, right, you're going to have less ground substance. Right? You won't have as many blood vessels available. So anywhere that you need to have stretchiness, all right, present, all right? So the blood vessels that are closest to your heart, all right, they're called capacitance vessels because the force of the blood coming out of your heart is relatively high pressure area there. So if it wasn't able to stretch with every heartbeat, you'd blow out your aorta, okay? So you're going to find this, all right, in your large arteries, specifically your aorta, all right, your brachiocephalic arteries, the subclavian. You'll get into this when you do the circulatory system. The trachea, okay, that needs to be able to expand and relax, all right, or stretch and recoil. Vocal cords, all the time. All right, right now, I'm utilizing my vocal cords and they're being put under a lot of stress and the elastic fibers. And this is why, one of the reasons why when people that smoke, and I'm not doing a PSA public service message for anti-smoking, but smoking, the chemicals in the smoke destroy elastic protein fibers. And if you do it enough times, you just decrease the integrity. And just like if you ever owned a pair of gym shorts or athletic shorts for like 10 years, the elastic band starts to wear out. That's the same thing that happens, all right, with the elastic fibers. So people that smoke usually have stiffer blood vessels, and they're more prone to aneurysms because your blood vessels, when you change your blood pressure, more pressure, the vessels get stretched more, all right? Less pressure, they recoil. So they lose that ability to do that. So God forbid, your blood pressure increases a big amount in a certain blood vessel that does not have that capacity, it can tear. You can have an aneurysm.
Can they like regenerate the elastic part?
As we get older, they don't regenerate as well as they did when you were in your 20s. So that's another reason, you're more likely to have an aneurysm in your latter ages, but now if you're a smoker, you increase it even more because you're adding more to it. But yeah, unfortunately, as we get older, just like with anything, we start to slow down. All right, the second type of connective tissue is our supporting connective tissue. And there's two types. So we've already seen this. This thing, it's gonna start to get a little bit easier now, y'all. All right, we're done with all that kind of craziness because now we're gonna do supporting connective tissue. We'll talk about fluid, but then we get into muscle. And then we get into nervous tissue. So it becomes a little bit easier here. All right. So there's two types, cartilage and bone. So we're going to start off with the first one, that's cartilage. Okay. So we call cartilage a semi-solid. And it's semi-solid because it has a high water content. All right. And it's because of that high water content that makes it a little bit more flexible than bone. Bone is relatively rigid. There's a little bit of flexibility to bone, very little. All right. But cartilage is going to be a little bit more flexible, okay? And so its extracellular matrix, which is made up again of the collagen, the protein fibers, right, and the ground substance. But its extracellular matrix is loaded down with tons of collagen. It'll have some elastic protein fibers, but lots of collagen. So the predominant cell type in cartilage is called a chondrocyte. You need to know this. That's a mature cartilage cell. When it's a baby cell, we call it something different. We'll talk about that in chapter 7. I'm not going to throw that information into your brain right now. Got enough in there. I want to put more in there yet. We'll wait until after the first time. Okay? So these chondrocytes, they live in the cartilage. Okay, here's my chondrocyte. And and it lives in the cartilage in this little space here. You guys remember what that space is called, right? Little chamber, little house. Lacunae, that's right. Lacuna matata, that's right. Okay, that's the name of the space that the chondrocyte lives in. Okay. So now I almost made a mistake. Cartilage, not all types of cartilage, but cartilage has a covering around it. Okay, and I'll tell you which ones. Remember we talked about the 3 different types of cartilage in lab? Maybe not. We're going to come to it again. All right. But cartilage will have an outer covering. We call that the perichondrium. And that, again, we saw it on the previous slide here. It's made up of that dense, irregular connective tissue. Okay? So, again, this is more information from chapter 7, but the perichondrium has an outer layer. It's a fibrous layer. Okay, it's the tougher layer. That's usually what's made up of the dense, irregular connective tissue. Then it has an intercellular layer, right? And that's where these baby cartilage cells are going to be existing, all right? But again, don't worry about all that because we'll get into it in chapter 7. Okay, so a couple things that you need to understand. Cartilage is more flexible than bone, all right? It is one of the strongest, toughest types of connective tissue, all right, compared to the other ones that we've seen so far, okay? Stronger and tougher than reticular, stronger and tougher than adipose, obviously, all right? So we're going to see, all right, this type of connective tissue in areas that need to be resistant to mechanical stresses or what we call deformational change, okay? So a perfect example, when we did the skull, you noticed that you had a big opening where your nose used to be. Well, that's because that's cartilage there, all right? So when you rub the tip of your nose, what you're rubbing, all right, is hyaline cartilage, okay? And it's pretty, because if you push your nose to the side, it comes right back, or it doesn't break off or anything because it's resilient to that type of force, okay? So we're going to find cartilage, all right, and we're going to talk about the different types, all right, throughout your body in certain areas that need to have some support and some protection there, all right, where they need to be safe from permanent deformities, okay? Like it would really suck if I pulled my ear down and it stayed in that position, all right, but cartilage prevents that from happening, okay? So the 3 types here are hyaline, fibrocartilage, and elastic cartilage. We're going to run through each here, okay? So hyaline is the most common. It has a perichondrium. You need to know that because not all cartilage has a perichondrium. Hyaline does, okay? It's the most common. It's found in most areas where you would think to find cartilage, okay? So the tip of your nose, right? And part of that, remember we talked about briefly last week, the nasal septum, the bony nasal septum. There's 2 bones. We'll go over it again. All right, but anyways, part of your nasal septum is hyaline cartilage. Your trachea, you have these rings that go around your trachea. They're called C rings, all right, and they prevent your trachea from collapsing. And your larynx, part of your voice box. Where your ribs attach onto your sternum, that is called your costal cartilage. That's made up of hyaline cartilage. All your long bones. So the bones in your fingers are considered long bones. Bones in your arms, bones in your legs, wherever they connect to one another, all right, we call that articular cartilage, because bones are articulating or connecting to one another, all right? That is hyaline cartilage. That's where you'll find this type of cartilage. And before, usually the fetal skeleton starts to transition from cartilage to bone, anywhere between weeks 8 to 12. So prior to week 8, when you're a fetus and you start to take on that humanoid appearance, all right, you start to grow what we call the fetal skeleton, and most of that skeleton is going to be made up of hyaline cartilage, okay? All right, my favorite cartilage is fibrocartilage. This is the one that has to be very resistant to compressive forces because of where it's located. So you'll find this in areas that undergo a lot of compression. Okay, so your spine, your intervertebral discs are loaded with fibrocartilage. The menisci of your knees, those are those kind of shock absorbers in your knees, all right, that's fibrocartilage. And then what we call the pubic symphysis, all right, that's where your two hip bones come together and meet in the front of your pelvis. All right, it's about 2 inches below your belly button. Okay? So, an important fact to know about fibrocartilage: no perichondrium, none. Okay? Very little ground substance, if any. So if you look down here on this picture here, all right, anywhere where you find white, that's ground substance. Hardly any there. Okay? So very little. So in between the chondrocytes, this is where we're going to find a ton of those collagen fibers, those protein fibers, some elastic fibers, but tons of the collagen fibers. All right, the last type of cartilage is the elastic. And if you look at the name, you're pretty much familiar with what its role is going to be. Okay, this is the type of cartilage that can spring back to its original position. So your ear, for example, the epiglottis, which is that flap that covers your trachea. Okay? So it has quite a bit of elastic fibers. Okay? More elastic fibers than the collagen fibers. All right, but it also has a perichondrium. All right? And you'll see that the chondrocytes are going to be much closely packed compared to hyaline cartilage. All right. All right. Let's quickly jump into bone. We're not going to spend, remember, we have a whole chapter committed to these tissues here. So again, I'm not going to be, dwelling on them. We're going to go into a lot more. So I'm basically just trying to teach you the basics. When we get into chapter 7, you'll own this stuff. All right, bone. All right. It's stiffer than cartilage, all right, because it's a more solid type of connective tissue. All right. It does have, don't be fooled, bone has flexibility. It just doesn't have a lot. I'm sure you got a friend of yours. It's like, I'm not very flexible, and you might be able to bend over and touch your toes, and they can barely bend over and touch their knees. It's just how it is, So there is some flexibility to bone, okay, because there is an organic component to it, which we'll get into. All right. So when we talk about bone's composition, we break it down into an organic component and an inorganic. Okay. So just to memorize this right now, the organic components are these two items: collagen, protein fibers, and then glycoproteins, which is the ground substance. All right. And then the inorganic component is going to be what we call the calcium salts. You'll hear me refer to it as the hydroxyapatite, bone salts, whatever. All right. But that's the inorganic component, the calcium hydroxyapatite salts. Okay. So that's very important that you understand that bone has an organic and an inorganic component, because we're going to spend some time on that in chapter 7. So the mature bone cell is the osteocyte. And just like we saw with the cartilage, it lives in its own house. Okay, except the osteocyte looks a lot different. Kind of like this spidery type of cell. Anyways, its home is called the lacunae. Okay? There's two types. Compact, which we saw when we were in the lab, right? And then the spongy bone. Okay? So the compact bone, we learned this structure here, the osteon, the functional unit of compact bone. And the osteon is similar to like a tree. When you chop the tree down, you see it has rings. Well, that's what an osteon has. It has this hollow center, and it's called the central canal, right on. All right, and that's where we'll find blood vessels and nerves. And then you'll have these rings that surround it, all around. All right, and then spread out through all these rings, you'll find osteocytes living in their lacunae. I'll show you pictures. Okay. So just keep in mind the central canal. All right, you want to know this. That's where blood vessels and nerves are found, and that's been asked on a lab test before. All right, there'll be a picture of an osteon up there, and there'll be an arrow pointing to that, and it'll say, "What do we find inside this structure?" Okay, so you need to know what the structure is. Don't write nucleus. It's not a nucleus. Okay, people do that, and it makes me sad. All right, it's the central canal, and that's where blood vessels and nerves are found. All right, so I was asked that, and I got it very wrong. Wait, on the mock exam, was it the practice exam that asked you that, Alexia? On the path, okay, yeah. I know, it happens every semester, and I always try to give so many warnings. And that's why I'm saying, well, and I'll tell you guys this because I told the other section that I teach. When a slide comes up, when you're taking the test and you see the picture up there and you see an arrow pointing to it, before you get that first urge to type your answer in, just look to make sure that there's no words on the page. All right, like a question, okay? Because it could be pointing to a certain structure on a bone, but the question could say, what bone is this? And so many times people write on what the structure is, and that's not what the question was asking, okay? So make sure you scan whatever it is real quick, take you 2 seconds, to see if there's any words there. Read the question if there's words there, and be okay, this is asking me for what's that, okay? It's just so easy. You get into the groove and you're taking the test and everything, and you're like, all right, next structure, let me label it. Just make sure there's no words on it, all right? Trust me, I hate people losing points like that. All right, so deeper or internal to the compact bone, all right, we've got the spongy bone, all right? So that's the interior portion. And this is going to be, literally, we call it spongy bone because it looks like a sponge, all right? It has all these nooks and crannies through it. All right, so you got the spongy bone here, and it's got all these, we call them trabeculae. And there's these little kind of scaffolding structures that run through it. It's like these nooks and crannies all over the place. All right, so that's where you're going to find your bone marrow to make your blood elements. Okay, but it's because of this. If bones were solid, your weight would be 2 to 3 times more than what you are now. But thank goodness they're not. All right, they're hollow. Okay. So this spongy bone allows for the lighter weight that we have also, but because of the scaffolding network in here, it helps to contribute to the strength of the bone, okay? All right, a couple functions here, and then I'll wrap it up here. Bones allow movement because what moves bones? Muscles. All right, and that's based on a lever. And if you've taken physics and you understand first class, second class, third class levers, most of the bones and the joints in your body operate on what we call third class levers. All right, but it just has to do with the muscles pull on the bones. All right, and it causes movement to occur. That's all I want you to know. Okay. So we also know that it helps to support tissues, right? Because of the tissues that we find attaching to the bone. All right, a lot of organs will connect on the bone. They need an anchoring point. All right, ligaments connect bones to bone. Okay, obviously protection. That's what our ribs do. All right, storage of minerals. Remember what I said? Calcium and phosphorus are stored on the inside. Calcium we need for several functions: proper neuron function, proper muscle contraction function, blood clotting. The missing one. Oh, and obviously making bone, all right? There, that's what we're talking about, okay? And phosphorus, what's phosphorus for? What do we need phosphate for? Well, for our purposes, ATP, energy, yeah, adenosine triphosphate. But it also helps to make the hydroxyapatite, the bone salts. It's one of the components there. All right, so the process of making those cells that we find in our blood is called hemopoiesis. So So this is also a place that we're going to find where our blood cells are being made. And that's not just red blood cells. That's white blood cells, that's platelets, okay? All right, so this is a quick picture here of compact bone. We've seen this already. Here's your osteon. At the center, that's the central canal. And these little black dots here, those are the lacuna. And we can't see, but inside the lacuna, those are where the osteocytes live. All right, those bone cells. A lot of people think they're looking at this like, oh, this is a cell. It's not a cell. All right, it's tissue. All right, there's cells in the tissue. They live in these little black dots here. It always gets somebody. All right, we're going to stop here for today. I'm not even close to where I want to be, but that's all right. It's okay. We'll definitely wrap this up before. We'll definitely wrap it up. What's today? Tuesday? Thursday. Okay. And then let's take a break. We definitely need to take a break. Folks at home, we're going to take a 15-minute break. Okay. If you have questions, ask me in the lab. And for you here, folks, if you will sign just the first column for lecture on the